Okay, so we're going to pick it up. Now, here I have to confess, one of my sources would be Michael Loconis and Gary Habermas. They wrote a terrific book on the resurrection, and both of them approach this topic of the resurrection with the minimal facts approach. That is, what are the absolute minimal facts that the majority of scholars agree with? Now, my purpose here this morning was not to simply read their book to you. You can go buy their book and you can read their book for yourself. My point was to use them as a source, but to go on beyond that. So, Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion. That is almost a universally accepted fact when it comes to historians, when it comes to New Testament scholars, both liberals and conservatives. This day and age, nobody basically doubts the existence of Jesus of Nazareth and that he was crucified by the Romans. That's not to say that you today couldn't go online and find somebody who says Jesus of Nazareth never existed. You definitely can find people, especially on the internet, who say things like that. My point here is when it comes to scholarship, when it comes to both Bible-believing scholars and not Bible-believing scholars, basically nobody today doubts that Jesus of Nazareth existed and that he was crucified by the Romans. This crucifixion happened outside of Jerusalem. It happened around the Jewish Passover. It happened during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. It happened during the reign of Herod the Tetrarch. It happened during the priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. And several of our New Testament books report the crucifixion of Jesus. Roman crucifixion is incredibly well established. There's basically, once again, nobody of scholarship that's ever going to jump up and say Romans didn't crucify people. Romans crucified people and nobody doubts it. Okay? Romans were very, very good at crucifying people, and they're not the inventors of crucifixion. Crucifixion actually predates the writing the first century by a couple hundred years. Various groups, the Phoenicians, the Assyrians, did forms of crucifixion, but the Romans did so in such a way that was brutal, rather vulgar and disgusting, very public, and crucifixion was something that was held for the lower ranks, slaves and conquered people and so forth. There are actual laws saying that Roman citizens, they basically had to be convicted of treason, trying to assassinate the Caesar in order for a Roman citizen to get crucified. In fact, we'll get into this eventually, but when it comes to the traditions of how the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul died, what is the tradition of how the Apostle Peter died? Crucified upside down. When it comes to the tradition of how Paul died, beheaded. Why wouldn't Paul be crucified? Because Paul was a Roman citizen. Actually, we have writers, Roman authors and Greco-Roman authors, who say the word crucifixion shouldn't even be used in public society or in society because it was so vulgar, it was so bad, things like that. Now, we have witnesses, we have testimony of Jesus' crucifixion outside of the Bible. Tacitus, the Roman historian Tacitus, in his book Annals, chapter 15, starting in 44, he's talking about how Nero blamed the Christians for the fire in Rome and tortured them in various ways. The idea here is that Nero was the one who set the fires in Rome, and to get the blame off of him, he passed it on to the Christians, and he came up with elaborate and horrible ways to torture the Christians. Tacitus goes on to say the name originates from Christus, which is the Latin form of Christ. By the way, the Romans couldn't agree on how to spell Christus in Latin. Sometimes you get Christos, sometimes you get Christus. It doesn't matter. They also didn't have a dictionary where they had, firmly established the spelling of many things, right? Tacitus goes on to say the name originated from this Christus who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. This happened in Judea. A superstition started and spreaded to Rome. What is this superstition that Tacitus is referring to? Well, unfortunately, we don't know for absolute certain what this superstition is. What is it plausible that this superstition is? That Jesus rose from the dead, and this superstition eventually spread to Rome. So most scholars agree that Tacitus's writing here is authentic. They have no reason to doubt it. Josephus, Flavius Josephus. Now I realize that I've thrown out this name at you before, Josephus, and I've just expected you to know who Josephus was. But I want to tell you who Josephus was. Flavius Josephus was a Jew. He's pretty much a late contemporary, probably born around the 40s, so a little bit after the time of Jesus and so forth. Flavius Josephus, he was born in the 30s. Not the 40s. Flavius Josephus became a general, especially as we get into the 60s of the first century. We start to get more conflict between the Jews and the Romans. We eventually get the Jewish-Roman War. Flavius Josephus was one of the generals when Vespasian started to march into Judea. Now, at this point, Rome had had enough of Judea. Rome decided, we're going to knock you guys out. We're done with all of this nonsense, all of these rebellions and so forth. And so when Vespasian started to march, he started to destroy towns as he went along his merry way. And when you destroy a town, you absolutely smash it into the ground, and then you move on to the next town so that you don't have to watch your flank, right? So Flavius Josephus was a general in one of these towns, and he held out so long. His guerrilla tactics were so good that he drew the attention of Vespasian, so that when he was captured, Vespasian actually spared his life and took him hostage, So then you get Jews who think that Josephus has betrayed them. He's switched sides, he's switched loyalties. I don't think as you read Josephus, I don't think you see a guy who's given up Judaism. I think you see a guy who loved Jerusalem. I think you see a guy who loved the temple. And as the Roman armies, now Vespasian, he had to go back to Rome. Vespasian, you have the year of the 3 Caesars, and it looks like the Roman Empire is about to fall. And the Roman army wants Vespasian to be the Caesar. So he gets to be Caesar, he has to go back, he leaves his son Titus to continue to wipe out Judea. So when Titus has Jerusalem surrounded, and while Titus is going to knock out Jerusalem, Josephus is the go-between. He's the one trying to tell the Jews, surrender. If you surrender, they're not going to destroy Jerusalem, they're not going to destroy the temple. The Jews, of course, are saying there's not going to be a surrender and you're a traitor, So anyways, Josephus survives, of course, he survives the Jewish-Roman wars. He eventually moves to Rome, he lives a lavish life, and he eventually writes his books. Josephus writes in Antiquities, chapter 20, brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ, whose name was James. Here, Josephus is talking about the son of high priest Annas. Sometime after Pilate, and I forget the name of the next governor or so forth, he's out. The new governor is coming to town, and before the new governor gets to town, the high priest's son Annas gets James and some of the other Christian leaders and executes them. He gets in trouble for doing this, by the way, when the next Roman governor gets there, right? But here in Antiquities, Josephus is specifically saying that they brought in the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ, whose name was James. So this shows us that Josephus believed that there was this guy named James who was the brother of Jesus. Now, before we get to this next reference in Josephus to Jesus, I want to just upfront and admit that yes, in our Greek copy of Josephus, there are questionable alterations. They're probably Christian interpolations. That is, a Christian sometime got his hands on Josephus' Greek work and added some words to Josephus. We have Josephus in other languages, including an Arabic copy that does not have the question portions of the Josephus text. Now, why I bring this up is because in the Greek copy of Josephus, I meant to write down the place that this is located in Josephus. In the Greek copy, it mentions there was a man named Jesus, if it be lawful to call him a man. And you'd be wondering, Josephus never became a Christian. Josephus was always a Jew. If he's going to refer to Jesus, why would he say, if it be lawful to call him a man? There was a man named Jesus. He was the Christ. Josephus never became a Christian. Why would he ever call him the Christ? Pilate condemned him to crucifixion, and followers reported seeing him alive 3 days later. So those question points, if it be lawful to call him a man, and he was the Christ, those are probably a Christian added it later. And again, in Arabic copies of Josephus, we don't have those question points, but we still have the main point, that there was this guy named Jesus, that Pilate condemned him to crucifixion, and that 3 days after the crucifixion, his followers said that they saw him alive again. Now, isn't that an interesting thing to find in a secular or to find in a non-Christian source regarding this guy named Jesus? Now, this too is one of those questioned values. The Babylonian Talmud, in Sanhedrin 43, it talks about Yeshua. Yeshua was on the eve of the Passover. Yeshua was hanged. He practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostatize. Now, one of the Jewish criticisms of this is the fact that it doesn't say Yeshua of Nazareth or Yeshua the Christ or anything like that. It's just Yeshua. What is the name Yeshua in English? Well, it's closer to Joshua. Guess what? A lot of people in the first century had the name Joshua. A lot of Jews had the name Joshua. And some of them also got hanged on trees and also got executed and things like that. Now, there are details, such as it happened on the eve of the Passover, that he practiced sorcery. That's an interesting thing to claim of this person, that he practiced sorcery and that he enticed Israel to apostatize. So is this a clear reference to Jesus Christ? It's not absolutely clear, but it fits pretty good, doesn't it? Later Talmudic writings probably are not very helpful to us on this point. This may be late, and it may be a response to the Christians' charge of an unfair trial. This Babylonian Talmud passage goes on to say that a herald went out in Israel for 40 days, calling anybody to come be a witness for Yeshua. Nobody came forward to be a witness for Yeshua, and so we executed him. If you take that portion and you look at the gospel text, that doesn't seem to fit well with the gospel text, does it? So some people have wondered, is this an apologetic text written by the Jews later to say, no, Jesus got a fair trial. Stop going around saying Jesus didn't get a fair trial. Lucian of Samosate, 2nd century Greek writer, he's a satirist. That is, he's trying to be a comedian, and he's trying to satirize things that he doesn't agree with. He talks about these Christians who worship a man. This man that they worship, he's the one that introduced their rites, and he was crucified. So that's interesting that a satirist in the 2nd century is mentioning this guy who was crucified that these people worship. If you're a satirist, are you going to satirize small, obscure, unknown references, or are you going to talk about what everybody's talking about this day? If you're going to be a comedian, and you're going to be a good comedian today, and whether you're going to be a conservative or a liberal, wouldn't it do you a good service to watch the news to know that what the politician that you want to satirize, what he just said, right? Now, if you want to satirize, some obscure person, how popular are you going to be then? So this tells us that this satirist in the 2nd century obviously thought there were enough people who would know what he's talking about when he talks about the Christian. I imagine Jerry Seinfeld, by the way, up there telling jokes. So, have you heard about these Christians, right? What is up with these Christians? They worship a guy who was crucified. He's the one that, that's what I imagine him being a satirist. Maybe I'm way off on this one, Now these ones, I simply want to cite them as Christian, quasi-Christian sources outside of our New Testament. I clicked too far. There we go. The Gospel of Truth. The Gospel of Truth is a 2nd century gospel. It mentions Jesus was hanged on a tree or nailed to a tree. There are several documents that are not in our New Testament. Some of them were at least somewhat popular. Some of them were considered heretical very quickly. But the Acts of Pilate, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Epistles of Ignatius, the history of Joseph, that would be Joseph, the father of Jesus, by the way. The descent of Christ, the narrative of Joseph, the avenging of the Savior. This is actually a fascinating text. It was written in the 2nd century by somebody who imagined that when Jesus died, he went to the place of the dead and he punished those people who just tortured him, right? So it's a very interesting work. It's not Scripture. I'm not telling you it's Scripture. I'm not even telling you to read it, okay? The Acts of Peter and Paul, the Acts of Philip, the Acts of Andrew. We have all sorts of 2nd, 3rd, 4th century documents. They're not Scripture. I'm not citing them this morning as Scripture. I'm citing them as texts that mention the crucifixion, mention Jesus, mention these things within 100, 200, 300 years of Christ. Bart Ehrman, the New Testament critic, Bart Ehrman, in his book, How Jesus Became God, on the introductory page, Jesus was a lower-class Jewish preacher condemned for illegal activities and was crucified for crimes against the state. So here we have a New Testament critic saying that Jesus existed, Jesus was condemned, and Jesus was crucified. The Jesus Seminar, which was a thing in the early 2000s where liberal scholars got together, and if you remember, they took the Gospels and they decided to vote by bead. So everybody had these beads in front of them, both scholars and laymen, and you got to vote as we went through the Gospels. Do you think that this is something? Do you think that this is what Jesus said? Was one color bead. Do you think that this is similar to something that Jesus said? Do you think that this is not similar to something Jesus said? Do you think that this is not something that Jesus said? So this was a thing that happened in the early 21st century. In their book, The Acts of Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the Romans. So the reason I bring this up is because even the critical scholars, the mass majority of them agree, there was a fellow, his name was Jesus, he got crucified by the Romans. There is basically no doubt Jesus existed and he was crucified by the Romans. The early followers of Jesus of Nazareth believed he rose from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is the central theme of the early sermons recorded in the book of Acts, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, etc., etc. When we see the apostles there in the book of Acts preaching, what are they talking about? They're talking about Jesus was a guy who really liked love, and he told us to love our neighbor as he loved our... No, that's not what they're saying, is it? They're saying Jesus was the Christ, you killed him, God raised him from the dead. That is the bullet points of all of those early sermons in the book of Acts, isn't it? Where does the idea of resurrection come from in Judaism? Now, when we look at our pre-exilic texts, so all of the texts that predate the exile, 597, 596, Israel's views of death. So we take all of our early Old Testament books, and we just kind of do a survey of what is the Jewish view of death. We see that there's this place called Shiloh. It's the place of the dead. It's kind of a sleepy-ish place, you could describe it, as they're not active, they're not doing much in this place. It's a one-way street. We get some glimpses of something like a life after death, but not a lot. The early Hebrew scriptures aren't really about what happened when you die, are they? The majority of them actually just talk about when so-and-so died, he slept with his fathers. And it just kind of leaves it at that, you know. Now, in the exilic and post-exilic Israel view of death, resurrection becomes more prevalent, but there's a diversity of opinion on these texts. The book of Sirach, which is not in our Bible, it is in Catholic and it is in Orthodox Bibles. It's also sometimes called Ecclesiastes. The author there is saying that when you die, you stay dead. And he's writing in the post-exilic period. So it's not that once everybody got back from exile, Jews suddenly all agreed that there's something next. You know, you had some who believed there's something that comes next, and you have some that said, no, there's nothing that comes next. Now, we have three very interesting, mysterious, let's just call them end of lives in the Old Testament. We have Enoch, we have Moses, and we have Elijah. Enoch, of course, is in the book of Genesis. We have this quick little thing that says Enoch walked with God, and he was not, because God took him. And the author of Genesis just moves on. And we all go, wait, what do you mean? What are you talking about? What's going on here? And actually, in post-exilic literature, we actually get Jews sitting down and writing fantastic stories of what happened when Enoch was taken, where he went and what he became, and so forth. He actually, in those views, I'm not standing up here telling you any of those books are true. I'm simply saying in one of those books he becomes an angel. Moses, we know that Moses dies on Mount Nebo, right? And nobody is there, and nobody knows what happens to him. And it said that the angels took him away, or God buried him himself, so that nobody would know where his grave was. Some Jewish literature in the post-exilic come up with God resurrected him and took him up to be in heaven, or things like that. And finally, Elijah. We get the story of Elijah where he and Elisha are standing there in the fiery chariot and the whirlwind, and it takes him up to heaven, right? Now, in Judaism, both today and in ancient Judaism, there was no hope that you would get to do this, right? These are just stories of things that happened, but you had no chance of being the next Enoch. You had no chance of being the next Moses. You had no chance of being the next Elijah. Abraham, Samuel, David, Elisha, all of them died, just like regular, right? So we only get these three kind of obscure, well, I'm not going to call Moses obscure, am I? I'm not really going to call Elijah obscure either, right? But we have just these three interesting end of lives, right? And it's in the post-exilic time period that people wanted to revisit this and flesh it out and make some more of it. We have this interesting episode in 1 Samuel chapter 28, Samuel and the witch of Endor, where Saul the Urim and Thummim are not working for him. God is not answering him. So he finds this witch, and he goes to this witch, and he gets the witch to bring up the spirit of Samuel. Interestingly, in verse 15, Samuel says, "Why do you disturb me?" And it's an interesting thing for Samuel to say, "Why do you disturb me?" The word there doesn't mean, "Why did you wake me up?" It means, "Why are you troubling me?" So that's kind of an interesting thing, because again, some of the imagery we get of Shiloh, it seems like the dead are basically asleep, or maybe, something like that, right? But here, when Samuel gets called up by the witch of Endor, "Why are you troubling me?" In verse 14, the witch describes an old man in a robe. Saul immediately recognizes Samuel. He knows that this is Samuel. What's interesting about that is we get in the Gospels stories about encounters with the resurrected Christ, and some people don't recognize him right away. So that's kind of an interesting change in the Gospel. Somehow, Saul is able to recognize this image right away as being Samuel. But again, in the New Testament, we get Mary Magdalene and the disciples not immediately recognizing Jesus sometimes. Old Testament resuscitations. I'm not using the word resuscitation here in the CPR sense of the word, like somebody just fell over, somebody did CPR on them, and they revived in a couple minutes, right? We get these three stories: Elijah and the widow of Zarephan's son, Elisha and the Shulamite woman's son, and the dropping of the dead body into his tomb. Remember, the two guys are going to bury their friend. They hear a band of robbers. They drop the body. It falls on the bones of Elijah, and he comes back to life, right? So we have these interesting stories of resuscitations. And why am I calling these resuscitations and not resurrections? Well, the reason I'm calling these resuscitations and not resurrections is because the story is simply reported as this is what happened. And then the resuscitated person disappears from the story. You look at these two sons, and once they're back alive, they're no longer, if it was a stage production, the story moves on, right? We don't they play no further role in the story. And the same with this guy whose body was dropped on the bones of Elijah. It's reported that he gets back up. It's reported that he's alive again. But he's not an important character in the rest of the Bible. And it's presumable that these people eventually die again, right? Now, that's why I don't call this a resurrection in the sense of Jesus' resurrection. Because Jesus' resurrection, as we encounter him, we come to find out he still has the scars in his hands. He still apparently has the scar in his side. You apparently could touch him. I know that in the Gospel of John at that point, it doesn't say whether Thomas does or doesn't touch him. But he doesn't appear to be in the same state. He appears to be in the same body, but not in the same state, because somehow he can levitate, or he can walk through locked doors or something like that, and he's not going to die again. And so where we have these resuscitations in the Old Testament, they're similar, but they're not identical to the resurrection that we see of Jesus, right? Old Testament not resurrections. Where did Enoch go? What happened to him? Again, I told you about some post-exilic literature that's very fanciful. He goes to the 7 levels of heaven. He meets all of these angels. He gets told all of these stories. Right. But he doesn't come back. He's not an important figure in Judaism then going forward, is he? He's mentioned in Genesis, he's off the pages, and he's brought up in these fanciful, we might call them fan fiction today, right? Elijah He becomes an end times figure in one sense because we get the prophecy in Malachi, I'll send before you the spirit of Elijah. We get Jesus identifying the spirit of Elijah as being John the Baptist. So even there, we're not talking about the Elijah, the guy who was there on Mount Carmel calling down the fire. Jesus is not saying that, by the way, John the Baptist and him are identical. He's saying that the spirit of Elijah came with this. This isn't a reincarnation. This isn't a resurrection. Now, why resurrection? One of the interesting things about the Jews is sometime in the post-exilic period, some of them start to believe in a resurrection. Now, you can comb the annals of pagan mythology, Greco-Roman mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian, and all sorts of things. Nobody else believed in resurrection. In fact, as you get into Egypt, you get this whole huge land of the dead, and it's well developed what happens after death. But there's no resurrection. And then suddenly, the Jews start to believe in resurrection sometime after the exile. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes is the one. He is a Seleucid emperor. You'll remember that Alexander the Great comes down and conquers almost the entire known Mediterranean, and then starts to head towards Persia and places like that, and eventually he dies. And the legend is, on his deathbed, the generals are there and ask, who gets to take your place? And with his dying breath, he says, the strongest. Meaning, you guys got to battle it out to figure out who gets to take my place, right? And they break up the territory, and the Seleucids are the ones that will reign in the Levant, or reign in what today we call Israel, right? Now, Antiochus Epiphanes hated the Jews, and he hated Judaism. He was a very Greek kind of guy, and Greeks were very proud of their Greek thing. And so he outlawed Judaism, he outlawed circumcision, he outlawed kosher. There on the Second Temple, he sacrificed a pig on the altar, desecrating the temple. He set up a statue of Zeus in the temple. He absolutely hated the Jews. And the Jews figured out that when they didn't obey God, they went into exile. And so now that we're back in the land, we better obey God. So they've got Torah, they've got the way of God, and now they've got an issue, they've got a problem. The Seleucids are saying, no, 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 and God is saying, you know, keep kosher and things like that. And so for the first time, you have martyrs. You have people standing up to the Seleucids saying, I'm not going to obey you. I'm going to obey God. And so you get martyrdom. Now, once again, early Jewish literature, Judaism in the pre-exilic period, it's not a religion of martyrs. And in fact, religions of martyrs wasn't even a very popular thing, because in order to be a martyr, you kind of have to die, you know. Now, today, of course, we have the phrase playing the martyr, but that's a different thing, right? But by the time of the Maccabees was a rebellion during the reign of the Seleucids. The Maccabees said, no, we're not going to do this. They started to fight the Seleucids. They actually ruled in Jerusalem for a short time. We can see from the literature, the extra-biblical literature of the time, that people started to read Isaiah 26, they started to read Daniel 12, and they started to believe in some sort of a resurrection. And this was a thing for those who were loyal to God. But what did resurrection look like? Was it a corporal thing? In other words, was it a physical body thing? It seems that it started as only for the pious Jew. Only the one who remained faithful would be resurrected at the end. And at some point then, it changes to some will be raised to blessing and others will be raised to punishment. And so you start to get more of a general resurrection. Everybody's going to be raised at this thing. Now, is this the immortality of the soul? Once again, in pre-exilic literature, we get the idea that somebody goes to the land of the dead and they sleep with their fathers. They don't not exist, but they don't exist in the same way, right? Now, is this an immortality of the soul? Whatever it would be, Daniel chapter 12 is not explicit. Is this a reunification of the body and the soul being put back together somehow? Whatever it is, you start to get this diversity within Judaism. And by the time we get to the first century, we have at least 4 groups. We have the Sadducees, we have the Pharisees, we have the Essenes, and we have the Zealots. Now the Sadducees say there is no resurrection. The Pharisees say there is a resurrection. The Essenes, the people who lived out by the Dead Sea, and we believe they're the ones who did the Dead Sea Scrolls. We believe as either Vespasian or Titus were marching to destroy everything, they put those scrolls in the caves, you know. There's good reason in some of their scrolls to believe that they believed in some form of a resurrection. What exactly it looked like is not perfectly clear. Who's resurrected is not always perfectly clear. Now the Zealots, you can see why the Zealots, although we don't have their literature very good, you can see why they would want to believe in resurrection, because they're fighting for the cause. They're going to free Jerusalem they're going to free Israel from the pagan. And so if we die in battle, of course we're going to be resurrected and we're going to get rewards, right? Regardless of which group we're talking about, resurrection was an event that would happen at the end of time. Resurrection was something that would happen with judgment. And when you think about those examples that I brought up earlier, the non-deaths, Enoch, Moses, Elijah, and those resuscitations, they don't really play into this. You know, again, Isaiah 26, Daniel 12 are much more the text that the Jews headed into Jesus' time period. The 2nd century, the 1st century BC, building up to Jesus' time. The point is, though, that Jesus' resurrection... Oh, I should have advanced the slide there, my bad. I'm going backwards. There it is. Jesus' resurrection makes absolutely no sense in the Second Temple Jewish mind. And what I mean by that is Second Temple Jews were looking forward to the Messiah. The Messiah was going to come, and the Messiah was going to free Israel. He was going to reestablish the kingdom of David. He was going to bring in the Messianic kingdom. And there was no such thing in Second Temple Judaism of a dead and rising Messiah. Messiah doesn't die. Messiah defeats the pagans. And yet, for some reason, suddenly, the disciples, if they believed in resurrection, and we can't know, we can talk about the Sadducees, we can talk about the Pharisees, we can talk about the Essenes, but can we talk about the individual peasant, Jewish fisherman, Jewish tax collector? Can we talk about what they believe specifically? I don't know. You know, did they go to the synagogue on Straight Street where the Pharisees preached, or did they go to the synagogue on Bench Street where the Sadducees preached? Did they like the Pharisaic preaching better than the Sadducees, or did they like the Sadduceic preaching better than the Pharisaic preaching? Now, obviously, I'm being a little bit silly, and I'm taking modern how Christians choose churches. I like that church. I don't like that church. I like that church. I don't like that. But my question, I believe, is valid. According to Josephus, the Pharisees had more influence. but Josephus was a Pharisee. So is it a little bit helpful for him to say that the Pharisees had more? We don't know. At the individual level, we just don't know. But the point remains that it was a Jewish end-time event, not something that happens in the middle of history. And a dead Messiah is a failed Messiah. We have got to understand that. One of the things I believe the critic, whether it's a scholarly critic or an unscholarly critic, one of the things I don't think that they grasp, one of the things I don't think that they get is in Second Temple Judaism, there's no dying Messiah. We went over in a class several months ago, is Jesus a copycat of pagan religions? And we talked about how, pagan religions have some figure that dies and comes back, right? And oftentimes that's related to the crop cycle. Oftentimes that's related to the change of the seasons, right? When we look at Jesus' resurrection, it has nothing soever to do with the changes of the season and so forth. And they're also missing the point that in Second Temple Judaism, and if you feel like I'm pounding this drum a little bit heavy, it's only because I am. In Second Temple Judaism, there's no dying, rising Messiah. A dead Messiah is a failed Messiah. You cannot stress that enough. So, the fact that the disciples suddenly start to believe in Jesus' resurrection, where does that come from? They're not predisposed to believe in a dying and rising Messiah. So we don't have Pavlov going on here, and they've been classically conditioned to believe that one day this Messiah is going to come, he's going to die, he's going to come back. That's not Judaism. The New Testament accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. You all have read the Gospels. You all have read the crucifixion events, right? Other than John, we know where John is, right? During the crucifixion, where's John? He's at the cross. We know where Judas is, right? Where's Judas? He's gone and hung himself. Where's everybody else? Nobody knows. Nobody knows where they're at, right? They might be hiding out. They might be hiding for their lives. And in fact, as we read further into the resurrection accounts, into John, into the book of Acts, we find them hiding behind locked doors. Why are they hiding behind locked doors? Because they're afraid. The leader got caught. If the leader got caught, are they looking for us? Now I want to remind you of something. Remember that principle of embarrassment that I talked about earlier? Oftentimes, when you make up a story, you don't make up a story that makes you look like a coward, do you? You make up a story that makes you look like a hero. That time that we were standing there watching the guy run away with the money, right? And I busted out my mad ninja skills and I took him out, right? Not, I was hiding behind the park bench because I was scared, right? I mean, the principle of embarrassment plays into this. Let's just pretend. Let's just agree with the critic just for a moment, okay? The Gospels are written 30, 40, 50 years after the events, right? And they're just made up stories, right? Are you going to make up a story that you were hiding? I mean, what kind of a story is that? You're going to make up a story that gives you some sort of out on why you were hiding. Your mom's cat died and you had to run home and console, your mom's cat. I'm sorry. I didn't do that intentionally. You sprained your ankle that night in the garden when everybody ran away, and that's why you were hiding, right? You're going to make up a story like that. You're not going to make up a story that we were hiding because we were scared. That is a stupid story to make up 30, 40, 50 years after the fact if you want the story to succeed, right? All, with the exception of John and Judas, all of the disciples are hiding during the crucifixion and thereafter. At the report of the resurrection, right? The women discover the empty tomb. in Luke, what do? They go and find the guys. And they tell the guys, he's risen. And what do the disciples, what does it say? They don't believe him. We're 30, we're 40, we're 50 years after the event, we're making up stories. Okay? If we're going to just make up stories 30 or 40, 50 years after the event, are we going to make up stories that make us look like we believed and we were faithful and we knew that he was coming? Or are we going to make up stories that say, when the ladies came and told us that Jesus' tomb is empty and that he's been raised, and we said, you're crazy? Or which one are we going to make up? Seriously. Suddenly, they're preaching the resurrection. They skip the cross. They skip going to the tomb. And suddenly, they're preaching the resurrection boldly in Jerusalem, Acts chapter 2, in the temple, Acts chapter 3, and before the Sanhedrin. What changed them? What changed them from these hiding, cowering, fearful followers into brave, bold preachers there in Jerusalem? Do you think they're still looking for the followers of Jesus some days later? Do you think they might be looking for them at the temple? Do you think going before the Sanhedrin, the very body of Judaism that condemned Jesus to death, they're going to go and preach in front of them? This comes from N.T. Wright's book, The Challenge of Jesus. Now, actually, up here on the slide, I'm actually going to read a bit more of this because N.T. Wright makes a terrific point here that absolutely has to be said. It has to be said both to the scholar critic, it has to be said to the non-scholar critic. If the Messiah you had been following was killed by the pagans, you were faced with a choice. You could either give up the revolt, give up the dream of liberation. Some went this route, notably the rabbinic movement as a whole after AD 35. Or you could find yourself a new Messiah, possibly from the same family as the lamented one. So what he just said is you've been following this guy that you think is the Messiah, and he gets himself killed by the Romans. He gets himself killed by the pagans. You, the followers of this guy, have two choices. One, you can give up and you can go home. And if you do it quietly, maybe you'll escape with your life, all right? We don't know him. We never knew him. We weren't with him, things like that. The second option is to get yourself a new Messiah, possibly from the same lineage. We see this in the continuous movement that ran from Judas the Galilean in AD 6 to his son or grandson in the 50s, to another descendant, Mahan, during the War of 66 through 70, and another descendant, Eleazar, who was the leader of the ill-fated Sakata on Masada in 73. So your other option, if your Messiah gets killed, is to get his brother, get his cousin, get somebody, right? And Judas the Galilean, he's actually mentioned there in the book of Acts. When he dies, the rebellion, the zealots, they continue. They get his son or his grandson to be the next one, right? And even when he dies, if you don't know what Masada is, Masada was the last holdout after Rome came in and destroyed everything, destroyed Jerusalem and so forth. Herod had built himself this terrific palace up on this high hill, right? It's called Masada. And so the zealots, they took it over. They conquered it and they lived up there, right? And they're going to be independent up there, right? And so what the Romans did was the Romans built a dirt ramp up to Masada so that they could take Masada. And if you've ever seen the movie, it romanticizes it a bit more, and you have some things that are absolutely historically inaccurate. But the Jews up there in Masada figure out what's happening. They're limited, they're surrounded, there's no escape. And so instead of committing suicide, what they start to do is they start to draw lots. And the lot falls to one person to slit somebody's throat, and the lot falls to somebody to get your throat slit. So that as we do this again and again and again, it gets down to only one person left. And so only one person has to commit suicide rather than the whole group. Again, let us be clear. If after the death of Simon Bar-Giora in Titus's triumph of Rome, you suggested that Simon was really the Messiah, you would have invited sharp response from the average first century Jew. What this means, when Titus conquered Jerusalem, there was a guy, his name was Simon Bar-Giora. Some people believed him to be the Messiah. And in fact, somehow, and the stories vary, somehow after the destruction of the temple, there's some tunnels, and some of the zealots, some of the rebels are still, hiding out in the tunnels looking for food and so forth. Apparently he either got a white robe or a white ephod, and somehow he was able to creep up to the Temple Mount and to suddenly appear. And the Romans actually were a bit shocked by this guy just suddenly showing up and so forth. But once their initial shock, and he's not calling down the thunder on them and so forth, he gets arrested, right? And when Titus has destroyed the temple, has destroyed Jerusalem, and gets to go back to Rome as the conquering hero, they carve the Arch of Titus, which is still there. And the Arch of Titus has these carvings of them bringing back the menorah, bringing back all of the spoil and so forth. And as Titus triumphantly enters Rome, they're bringing the spoil, everybody's cheering. At the end of the procession is Simon Bar-Giora, the king of the Jews, being led in chains and so forth. And he's led in, and they're throwing rotten tomatoes at him or whatnot, and they flog him and they kill him. Now, what N.T. Wright is saying is, after that, if you started to go around and say to people, I think he really was the Messiah, the first century Jew would look at you like, are you crazy? If, by way of example, you were to say you had a strong sense that Simon's still being with you, still supporting you, still leading you, the kindest response you might expect was that his angel or his spirit was communicating to you, not that he had been raised from the dead. You wouldn't go around saying that Simon had been raised from the dead. They would say, what are you talking about? They got him, they killed him, So the third step in the argument, once again, granted that Jesus of Nazareth was certainly crucified as a rebellious king, being scourged as Simon Bar-Giora was before execution, we are bound to regard it as extremely strange that the early Christians not only insisted that he was actually the Messiah, but reordered their worldview, their praxes, their stories, their symbols, their theologies around this belief. They had the two normal options open to them. They could have given up Messianism and gone on to live some sort of quiet, inner-religious private life. They clearly did not do this. But they went on preaching that Jesus was not only Messiah, but he was also Lord of the world. Equally interesting, they could have found somebody to be their new Messiah from amongst Jesus' blood relatives. We know very well from early sources that there was this fellow named James in the early church who was the brother of Jesus. It's very important to note that at no point did anybody start to say that James is now the Messiah. They always said that Jesus is the Messiah and James is the brother of Jesus. So N.T. Wright's point here is very simple. There's no dying, rising Messiah in Judaism, and if your Messiah gets killed, you got those two options. You either slip out of town quietly and pretend you weren't part of the group, or you get yourself a new Messiah. And the Christians didn't do this. The Christians insisted Jesus was the Messiah and that he had been raised from the dead. So it's so strange that this is the shape that early Christianity took when we see from all of the other movements, be it Judas the Galilean or Simon Bar-Giora, or 100-ish years after Jesus, you get Simon Bar Kokhba, and even he gets killed by the Romans eventually. And again, nobody runs around saying Simon Bar Kokhba really was the Messiah and he was resurrected. So we as investigators of history have to ask, why did the Christians do this? Just a couple more things and we'll end our time here. Bart Ehrman, once again, New Testament critic in the book The Triumph of Christianity. Jesus died around 30. That would be around 30 AD. Paul's chronology references, let's just say 33. Paul as the persecutor of the first, Paul as persecutor within the first 3 years of the church's existence, the original followers came to believe he was resurrected. This is critical because we have a New Testament critic not saying that Jesus died and then 30 years later people went around saying he was resurrected. But within 3 years, people were going around saying that he was resurrected. N.T. Wright, once again, the guy I was just reading, the resurrection. Christianity's origin is tied up with the early belief in Jesus' resurrection. The Christians, who remember, the early Christians were Jewish, right? They start to alter their stories. They start to change things. And now, one final point, and then we'll be done this morning. One final point. There are a lot of things in the New Testament, aren't there? When it comes to events, and when it comes to ideas, and when it comes to parts about Jesus, right? Jesus' virgin birth, right? It's there. It's there early in the first couple chapters of Matthew and in the first couple chapters of Luke. Is it anywhere else in the New Testament? Does it ever get brought up again? Not really. You could say that Paul perhaps makes reference to it in Galatians when he says, born of a woman. But then again, who wasn't born of a woman? So, the point here is, despite the fact that the virgin birth is there, it's not what Christianity got going with. It's not what they went around preaching, saying, you need to know about Jesus, he was born of a virgin. The early Christians went around saying, you need to know about Jesus because he died and rose again. The resurrection is the heart of the Christian message. It's there at the beginning. It's what the message is all about. And you cannot explain the rise of early Christianity without the resurrection. With that, we'll go ahead and close our time. We'll meet again. I want to open the floor for questions.